A rich man throws a mysterious briefcase into the forest, unaware that his loyal parrot is following him. As the bird approaches the discarded object, it goes into shock, revealing a cruel secret the millionaire's wife hides about his elderly father. The rich man, whose name was Arthur, felt a momentary relief as he watched the briefcase disappear among the dense bushes. It was as if a weight, imposed by his wife's insistence, had finally been lifted. He turned to go back to his car, his mind already wandering to the day's commitments, when a sharp, piercing sound tore through the forest silence. It was Luro, the parrot with his vibrant green feathers and a gaze that seemed to carry the wisdom of 1,000 years, descended in a quick and clumsy flight, landing not far from where the briefcase had fallen. Arthur frowned. Luro rarely ventured so far from the house, and his presence there was, at the very least, unusual. "Luro, what are you doing here, you rascal?" Arthur called, a soft, chiding tone in his voice. But the parrot didn't respond with his usual imitation of laughter or some funny phrase. Instead, Luro began cackling and flapping his wings frantically, not in the air, but against the ground, moving towards the briefcase. His eyes, usually full of mischief and intelligence, were now wide, almost wild. He pecked at the briefcase's leather with desperate fury, emitting squawks Arthur had never heard before. Arthur stopped, curiosity overriding his haste. Luro's behavior was completely atypical. The bird seemed to be in a state of genuine panic, as if the briefcase were a threat, or worse, something he needed to reach. "Luro, stop that! What's gotten into you?" Arthur approached hesitantly. The parrot ignored him completely, continuing to peck and scratch at the briefcase, emitting a sound that seemed like a muffled lament, almost a cry. Suddenly, Luro stopped pecking and looked at Arthur. His eyes now were not wild, but carried an intensity that made Arthur take a step back. The bird then let out a sound. It wasn't a word, nor a cackle. It was a perfect, chillingly accurate imitation of his father's dry, drawn-out cough, followed by a faint groan. Arthur's heart skipped a beat. He knew that sound. It was the cough his father had been having more frequently in recent months, the one that left him breathless. Luro, who spent hours in the old man's room, had captured every nuance of the elderly man's fragility. The parrot repeated the cough, stronger this time, and then tapped his beak on the briefcase again, looking at Arthur with an almost human urgency. It was as if he was trying to say, "It's here! The answer is here!" A wave of unease washed over Arthur. The briefcase, his father's cough, his wife's insistence that he discard it without looking. A cold, sharp pang of doubt began to form in his chest. He had always trusted his wife blindly, but Luro's desperation was undeniable, and the imitation of his father's cough was a direct blow to his conscience. "What are you trying to tell me, Luro?" Arthur murmured, more to himself than to the bird. He knelt, his hand extended towards the briefcase, but Luro darted forward, landing on the object and looking at Arthur with an expression that seemed to plead. The parrot pecked at the clasp of the briefcase, then looked at Arthur, then at the clasp again, repeating his father's cough. The scene was surreal, but the message, though non-verbal, began to take shape with disturbing clarity in Arthur's mind. His parrot, his loyal companion, was in shock because of that briefcase, and was directly linking it to his father's debilitated health. Arthur felt a shiver run down his spine. The briefcase, which he believed to be a mere discard, now seemed an object laden with a dark secret. And Luro, with his peculiar intelligence, was determined to make him see. The truth, he realized with a shudder, could be locked inside. Arthur felt the thin forest air weigh heavily in his lungs. The scene before him was as bizarre as it was unsettling. Luro, a parrot, was acting as a harbinger of a dark truth, and with each peck at the briefcase's clasp, the wall of trust Arthur had built around his wife began to crack. The imitation of his father's cough, repeated with an almost desperate urgency, was a ghostly echo that resonated in his mind. "Luro, what? What do you want me to do?" Arthur whispered, his voice hoarse. He extended his hand again, this time with a cold determination. The parrot, as if understanding, jumped from the briefcase to Arthur's shoulder, his small eyes fixed on the leather object. He nipped Arthur's ear lightly, then pecked the briefcase's clasp with a dry click. Arthur hesitated for a second, the image of his wife, Clara, surfacing in his mind. She had been so convincing, so sweet, in asking him to get rid of that useless old junk that only collected dust. And the idea that Clara could be involved in something so nefarious was a blow to his ordered world. But Luro's desperation was real, palpable, and his father's cough. With a heavy sigh, Arthur knelt completely, his fingers trembling slightly as he reached for the metal clasp. There was no padlock, just a simple latch mechanism. With a soft click, the briefcase opened. The scent of medicine, faintly sweet and chemical, rose into the air. Arthur looked inside, and his heart seemed to stop. The briefcase did not contain useless old junk. It was meticulously organized, divided into two sections. On one side, there was a series of vials and blister packs of pills, all with clear labels and names of medications Arthur recognized as being crucial for his father's cardiac and respiratory condition. These were the remedies the doctor had prescribed, the ones he paid fortunes to ensure his father had. On the other side, however, there was a collection of identical vials in shape, but with generic, almost faded labels. Some said vitamin supplement, and the others mild symptom relief tablets. But what caught Arthur's attention most was a small note, folded and tucked between the generic blister packs. With trembling hands, he picked it up and unfolded it. Clara's elegant and familiar handwriting filled the paper. "Arthur, darling, don't worry about these. They're just placebos. The old man doesn't need all this. Just give him the supplements, and he'll be fine. Less trouble for us. Zoxo, Clara." Arthur's world crumbled. The forest, the birdsong, the smell of damp earth. Everything became a distant blur. His gaze fixed on the words, on the letters that danced before his eyes, each one a stab in his chest. Placebos. His wife was giving his father placebos. A wave of nausea hit him, so strong he had to lean on the briefcase to keep from falling. The blindness, the blind trust he had placed in her. Clara's insistence that he not worry about his father's medicines, that she would take care of everything. The excuses for the elderly man's worsening health. "It's his age, darling. He's just a little depressed." It was all a farce, a cruel and calculated manipulation that unfolded under his own roof, right under his nose. Luro, who was on his shoulder, let out a soft chirp, almost a lament. The parrot rubbed his head against Arthur's cheek, as if sharing his pain, or perhaps as if saying, "I tried to warn you." Arthur closed the briefcase with a dull thud, the sound echoing in his mind like a gunshot. He stood up slowly, his body rigid, his face pale. Anger began to bubble in his stomach, a cold and relentless fury. It wasn't just the betrayal of him, but the cruelty against his father, an elderly and vulnerable man who trusted them. He looked at the briefcase in his hands, now no longer an unimportant object, but a Pandora's box full of lies and malice. And then he looked at Luro, who stared back with an intensity that seemed to say, "Now what? What are you going to do?" The truth was there, naked and brutal. Arthur, the rich and successful man, had been deceived, manipulated, turned into an unwitting accomplice to a heinous plan. The image of his father, weak and coughing, superimposed on Clara's smiling image. The farce had been unmasked, not by a detective or an investigation, but by a loyal parrot. And now, Arthur knew he could no longer live with the lie. He would have to confront the woman he loved, and the truth, he realized with a shudder, would be devastating. Arthur felt the thin forest air weigh heavily in his lungs, as if the oxygen had suddenly been sucked out. He reread the note, looking for an error, a misinterpretation, but the words were undeniable, Clara's handwriting unmistakable. Less trouble for us. The phrase echoed in his mind, cold and calculating, devoid of any affection. The small animal, with its peculiar intelligence, had been the only one to see the truth, the only one to try to sound the alarm, and Arthur, in his arrogance and blind trust, had failed to listen. The rich, successful man who controlled empires had been deceived by his own wife, not just deceived, but turned into an unwitting accomplice to a heinous plan. The image of his father, weak and coughing, superimposed on Clara's smiling image, and the dissonance was a torment. Anger began to bubble in his stomach, a cold and relentless fury he had never felt before. It wasn't just the betrayal of him, but the cruelty against his father, an elderly and vulnerable man who trusted them, who depended on them. The weight of the briefcase seemed unbearable, laden with the irrefutable proof of Clara's perfidy. Arthur knew he could no longer live with the lie, with the guilt of his own blindness. He would have to confront the woman he loved, the woman with whom he had built a life. The truth, he realized with a shudder that ran down his spine, would be devastating. But there was no other way. He needed to do right by his father and by himself. With the briefcase firmly clutched, Arthur turned and began to walk back to the car, each step heavy with the burden of discovery. The forest, once a refuge of peace, now seemed a stage for the drama that was about to unfold. He was going home, but not to the home he knew. He was going to a battle, and the enemy was the person who slept beside him. Arthur walked back, the briefcase weighing in his hand like a lead burden, not for its physical contents, but for the overwhelming weight of the truth it revealed. Each step on the damp forest earth seemed to echo the furious beat of his heart. The air, once fresh and invigorating, now seemed dense and oppressive, suffocating him with the reality of betrayal. Lauro, still perched on his shoulder, remained silent, a mute but powerful presence that reminded him of his own blindness. Clara's words in the note danced in his mind, repeating like a macabre mantra, "Placebos, less trouble for us." The coldness of those phrases was a brutal contrast to the image of the woman he loved, the woman who always showed herself to be so affectionate, so concerned with everyone's well-being, especially his father's. How could he have been so foolish? So easily manipulated. Shame and anger mixed in a bitter cocktail that made him feel nauseous. He remembered the countless times Clara had insisted on administering his father's medication, claiming he was too weak or too confused to do it alone. The excuses for his father's worsening health. "It's his age, darling. He's just a little depressed," now sounded like cruel lies, carefully orchestrated to deflect any suspicion. Arthur felt a lump in his throat, a mixture of fury and a deep pain for his father's vulnerability, so vilely exploited. The image of his father, weak, coughing, losing weight, superimposed on Clara's smiling image, and the dissonance was a torment. He had trusted her blindly, entrusting her with the most sacred responsibility, the care of his progenitor. And she had turned that trust into a weapon, a tool for her own convenience and perhaps something far darker. As he emerged from the dense foliage and saw the imposing mansion he called home, Arthur felt a shiver. The house, once a symbol of his wealth and success, now seemed a fortress of deceit, a stage for the unfolding farce. The mirrored windows seemed to watch him, reflecting not the sunlight, but the darkness that had settled in his heart. He clutched the briefcase more tightly, the irrefutable proof of his disgrace. There was no more room for doubt. The truth, naked and brutal, was there, and he knew he could no longer live with the lie, with the guilt of his own blindness. The fury, once cold and relentless, began to warm, transforming into an iron determination. Lauro, as if sensing the change in his state of mind, nipped his ear lightly, a silent reminder that he was not alone in this discovery. The Parrot, the most unlikely of detectives, had been the beacon in his darkness. Arthur opened the car door, threw the briefcase onto the passenger seat and sat behind the wheel, but did not start the engine immediately. He needed a moment, a last breath of air, before plunging into the abyss. The confrontation was inevitable, and he knew it would be devastating. Not just for Clara, but for him too. The life he knew, the marriage he believed to be solid, everything was about to crumble. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm in his chest. The image of his father, debilitated, reappeared, and with it, a new wave of anger, but also of purpose. He needed to do justice for his father and for himself. With his jaw clenched, Arthur started the car. The engine purred, a sound that was once familiar and comforting, but now seemed like an omen. He drove down the tree-lined driveway towards the house, each meter traveled, bringing him closer to the confrontation. He imagined Clara, perhaps in the living room, reading a book, or in the kitchen, preparing lunch with that sweet and deceptive smile. The idea of seeing her again, knowing what he knew, was almost unbearable. As he parked in front of the main entrance, Arthur turned off the engine. The silence that followed was deafening. He picked up the briefcase, its weight now a constant reminder of the battle that was about to begin. Luro, on his shoulder, seemed to share the gravity of the moment, his small eyes fixed on the mansion's door. Arthur got out of the car, the briefcase firmly clutched. He looked at the solid oak door, the barrier between truth and lies. There was no escaping. He was ready, or at least he had to be. The home he knew had become a battlefield, and he was about to go to war with the woman he loved. Arthur drove back to the mansion, the car engine purring under the hood, a sound that was once familiar and comforting, but now seemed like a dark omen. The briefcase was on the passenger seat, an inert object, but with an overwhelming weight of truths and lies. Luro on his shoulder remained quiet, his small eyes observing the passing landscape, perhaps sensing the storm forming within Arthur. Arthur's mind was a maelstrom. Clara's words from the note, placebos, less trouble for us, echoed relentlessly, each syllable a stab in his heart. He felt like an idiot, blind, an unwitting accomplice. How could he have been so naive, so easily manipulated by the woman he loved? The image of his father, debilitated, coughing, losing vitality, mingled with the memory of Clara's smiles, of her caring hands administering the medicines. It was an unbearable dissonance. Anger bubbled, hot and corrosive. It wasn't just the betrayal of him, but the calculated cruelty against his father, an elderly and vulnerable man who trusted them. Arthur gripped the steering wheel so hard, his knuckles turned white. He felt the need to scream, to break something, to vent the fury that consumed him, but he restrained himself. He needed clarity, control. The approaching battle would demand it. As he turned into the driveway leading to the mansion, the imposing structure of stone and glass came into view. Before, it was his sanctuary, his family's home. Now it seemed like a fortress of deceit, a stage for the unfolding farce. The windows, which once reflected the sunlight in a welcoming way, now seemed like empty eyes, watching him with silent judgment. Arthur parked the car in front of the main entrance, but did not turn off the engine immediately. With his jaw clenched, Arthur turned off the engine. The silence that followed was deafening, filled only by the ringing in his ears and the furious beat of his heart. He was ready. He opened the door and entered the house. The entrance hall was silent. The light filtered through the stained glass windows, creating colorful patterns on the marble floor. The smell of fresh flowers and the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee, the familiar scents of his home, now seemed strange, almost suffocating. "Clara," he called, his voice sounding hoarser than expected. There was no answer. He walked through the living room, empty. The impeccable kitchen was also deserted. Arthur's heart pounded. Where could she be? He climbed the stairs, each step feeling like an eternity. The briefcase in his hand was a weight, a weapon. As he reached the landing, he heard a sound coming from his father's room, a faint cough, followed by a soft, melodic voice, Clara's voice. He reached the doorknob of his father's room. He could hear her talking, probably with his father, with that false sweetness that now sickened him. He closed his eyes for an instant, taking a deep breath. The scene he was about to witness, or interrupt, would be the point of no return. He opened his eyes, a cold determination hardening his gaze. The truth would be revealed, and the consequences, he knew, would be irreversible. Arthur opened his father's bedroom door with deliberate slowness, every millimeter of creaking wood seeming amplified in the tense silence. The scene before him was a punch to the gut, an image of hypocrisy so perfect it almost made him laugh in despair. Clara was sitting on the edge of the bed, holding a small spoon and offering it to his father, who, weak, tried to swallow what appeared to be porridge. She smiled, a sweet and concerned smile, as she delicately wiped a corner of the elderly man's mouth with a napkin. "That's right, darling. Just a little more for you to get strong," she said, her voice melodic and full of a false tenderness that now sickened Arthur to his soul. His father, with eyes clouded by illness and age, seemed to accept the attention with resigned gratitude. Luro, perched on Arthur's shoulder, let out a low, almost inaudible squawk, as if sharing his owner's revulsion. Arthur felt the fury bubble, hot and uncontrollable. The image of his father, so vulnerable, being deceived by that woman, was a torment. He gripped the briefcase so hard, his knuckles turned white. "Clara," Arthur's voice cut the air like a blade, cold and laden with a contained rage that made the woman jump in fright. Her smile froze, and she turned, eyes wide at seeing him there, standing in the doorway, the briefcase in his hand, and an expression she had never seen before on his face. "Arthur, my God, you scared me. What happened? Why that look? And what is that in your hand?" she asked, trying to regain her composure, her voice still with a tone of concern, but now tinged with a note of surprise and perhaps a flicker of apprehension. She looked at the briefcase, then at Luro, who stared back at her with an unusual intensity. Arthur ignored the questions, taking a step forward, then another, until he was very close to the bed. His eyes, once full of love and trust, were now wells of disillusionment and fury. He didn't avert his gaze from her, not for a second. "I know, Clara," he said, his voice low, but laden with an intensity that made her recoil slightly. "I know everything." Her smile faltered completely. "Know what, darling? You're scaring me. Dad isn't well. This isn't the time for whatever this is." She tried to deflect attention, pointing to his father, who watched the scene with painful confusion. "Don't try to deceive me, Clara. Not anymore," Arthur retorted, raising the briefcase to her eye level. "You asked me to discard this. You said it was junk I didn't need to see." Clara's eyes fixed on the briefcase, and Arthur saw recognition, followed by panic, flood her face. The color drained from her cheeks, and her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. "Luro led me to it," Arthur continued, his voice now a deadly whisper. "He showed me what you were hiding." He popped open the briefcase with a dry snap, revealing the contents, the original medicine bottle still full and the crumpled note. Clara looked at the vials, then at the note. Her eyes widened. She tried to speak, but her voice failed. I don't know what you're talking about, Arthur. That's not mine." Arthur took the note and unfolded it, extending it so she could see her own handwriting. "It's not yours? Placebos. Less trouble for us. Do you remember writing this, Clara? Or is your memory as convenient as your morals?" Clara's mask crumbled completely. Her eyes filled with tears, but not of remorse, Arthur realized, but of desperation at being discovered. She looked at his father, who now seemed to understand something, a shadow of sadness and betrayal in his tired gaze. "Arthur, please. I can explain," she pleaded, her voice choked, reaching out to him. "It's not what you think." "It's not what I think," Arthur asked, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "My father is wasting away, Clara. You were poisoning him with placebos, while the medicines that could save him were kept here, waiting to be thrown away, and you still have the audacity to say it's not what I think?" Luro, as if sensing the climax of the revelation, flew from Arthur's shoulder and landed on the edge of the bed, staring fixedly at Clara, his small eyes shining with an almost human intelligence. Clara recoiled, her eyes fixed on the parrot, as if he were the true accuser. Arthur's father, with a visible effort, tried to sit up, a groan of pain and shock escaping his lips. "Father, don't exert yourself," Arthur said, turning to him for an instant, his voice softening minimally before turning back to Clara, his fury renewed. "You won't hurt him anymore. This game is over, Clara. It's over." The silence in the room was heavy, filled only by Clara's ragged breathing and Arthur's furious heart. The truth, naked and brutal, had been exposed, and the consequences, Arthur knew, would be devastating for everyone. The air in the room crackled with the weight of Arthur's last words. Clara, her face a mask of horror and desperation, staggered back, her hand flying to her mouth. The small spoon she held clattered to the floor, forgotten. Her eyes darted between Arthur, the open briefcase with the medicines, and Arthur's father, who now watched her with a mixture of pain and disbelief. "No, it's not like that, Arthur," she stammered, tears streaming down her face, but without the conviction of true remorse. I was just trying to protect you. Dad, he was so sick, and the doctors, they didn't know what to do. I just wanted to lighten the burden, for you and for me." Arthur let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Lighten the burden, poisoning my father, Clara, letting him slowly waste away while I, like a fool, trusted you to care for him. You call that lightening the burden?" He took a step forward, and Clara backed up again until her back hit the wall. "I wasn't poisoning him. They were placebos, Arthur. They wouldn't harm him," she cried, her voice rising in pitch, her victim facade crumbling into despair. "I just wanted him, for him not to suffer so much, for the transition to be smoother." "Transition to what, Clara? To death? You were accelerating my father's death for less trouble for us?" Arthur spat the words, pointing to the crumpled note he still held. "Do you think I'm an idiot? That I don't understand what less trouble means for an ambitious woman like you?" Luro, who was still on the edge of the bed, let out a sharp squawk as if agreeing with Arthur. Arthur's father, with a tremendous effort, raised a trembling hand. "Clara," he whispered, his voice weak but full of a deep pain. "How could you?" The sound of his father's voice seemed to hit Clara like an electric shock. She turned to the elderly man, her expression changing from anger to a sudden and desperate plea. "Dad, no, don't believe him. Arthur is confused. He doesn't understand. I love you, Dad. I only wanted what was best for you." Arthur intervened, placing himself between Clara and his father. "Don't try to manipulate him, Clara. Not anymore. He is no longer your target, and I am no longer your accomplice." He placed the briefcase on the nightstand, the medicine vials, and the note exposed as irrefutable proof. "You are leaving this house, now." Clara's eyes widened. "Leave? Arthur, don't be ridiculous. This is my house too. I am your wife." "You were my wife," Arthur corrected, his voice cold as ice. "You betrayed my trust, betrayed my love, and most unforgivable of all, you tried to take my father's life. There is no more us, Clara. There is no more marriage." You can't do this, she cried, tears now of fury. You'll regret this. I have rights. I have lawyers. You can't just kick me out. I can, and I will, Arthur replied, his voice unwavering. And if you try anything, Clara, I will take this evidence to the police. What you did is a crime. Attempted murder, gross negligence. Think carefully before you challenge me. The mention of the police made Clara turn even paler. She looked at the vials, then at the note, and finally at Arthur's implacable face. The desperation in her eyes was palpable. The reality of the situation finally hit her. Arthur, please, give me a chance, she pleaded, her voice now a broken whisper, her arrogance replaced by genuine fear. I made a terrible mistake, I know, but I can change. I can truly care for your father. Please don't do this. It's too late for that, Clara, Arthur said, shaking his head slowly. The pain in his heart was immense, but the anger and determination were greater. Trust is broken, irreparably. You have 1 hour to pack a bag with essentials. After that, you will leave, and you will not return. He turned to his father, who watched the scene with teary eyes. Father, I will take care of you. I promise. We will get the best doctors, and you will recover. Arthur's father nodded weakly, a single tear tracing a path down his wrinkled face. Luro, as if sensing that the battle was won, flew back to Arthur's shoulder, rubbing his head against his cheek. Clara, defeated, let out a sob. She knew there was no more arguing. The man she had manipulated for so long was now unwavering, and the truth, which she had tried so hard to hide, had been irreversibly exposed. She turned and left the room, her heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway, the sound of her muffled crying fading away. Arthur watched her go, feeling an empty feeling in his chest, but also a bitter relief. The farce was over. Now he had to begin to rebuild. First, his father's health, then his own life. He picked up the original medicine vials from the briefcase, the proof of his blindness and Clara's cruelty, and firmly held them. The fight was not over, but the first and most difficult battle had been won. The air in the room, once laden with accusations and despair, now seemed thin, heavy with the silence Clara left behind. Arthur felt a shiver run through his body, a mixture of exhaustion and a strange, almost frightening clarity. Luro, still on his shoulder, let out a soft chirp, as a reminder of his presence and the crucial role he played. Arthur knelt beside the bed, holding his father's trembling hand. "Father, forgive me," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I was blind. I should have seen. I should have protected you." Arthur's father faintly squeezed his hand. His eyes, once full of pain and confusion, now showed a flash of relief and gratitude. "My son," he managed to say, a tear tracing a path down the corner of his eye. "Don't worry, Father. I will fix everything," Arthur promised, rising with a new determination. He picked up the phone and dialed the emergency number, explaining the situation with surprising calm, requesting a medical team for immediate assessment and transport, if necessary. While waiting, he called his lawyer, instructing him to immediately initiate divorce proceedings and to prepare a restraining order against Clara. Arthur's voice was cold and professional, devoid of any emotion that could betray the storm still raging within him. "Luro, you were my guardian angel," Arthur said, stroking the parrot's head. "You opened my eyes." Luro snuggled closer, as if understanding the gravity of the moment. Minutes later, the doorbell rang. Arthur went downstairs, finding the medical team and his lawyer already at the door. He quickly led them to his father's room, explaining the situation in concise and urgent terms. As the doctors began to examine his father, Arthur stepped back a little, watching them with contained anxiety. With each passing minute, the reality of Clara's cruelty became sharper, and Arthur's guilt for his own negligence weighed even heavier. About 40 minutes passed. Arthur was in the living room, trying to process the events, when he heard heavy footsteps descending the stairs. Clara appeared, dragging a wheeled suitcase and a handbag. Her eyes were red and swollen, her face pale and drawn. Her smudged makeup gave her a ghostly appearance. She stopped on the last step, looking at Arthur with a mixture of hatred and despair. "You'll regret this, Arthur," she spat, her voice hoarse. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Arthur stared at her, his eyes devoid of any affection. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Clara, and you no longer have power over me or over my father." He pointed to the door. "Your time is up." Clara hesitated for a moment, as if expecting him to yield, for the sight of her misery to make him change his mind. But Arthur's face was a mask of steel. She let out a sigh of defeat, a broken sound barely audible. With a final, scathing look, she turned and walked out the main door, which Arthur had left open. The sound of the suitcase wheels on the asphalt, followed by her car engine starting and driving away, marked the end of a dark chapter. A heavy silence fell over the house. Arthur closed the door slowly, feeling a lump in his throat. There was no triumph, only a painful emptiness. The woman he loved, or thought he loved, had revealed herself to be a monster. He returned to his father's room. The doctors had already stabilized the elderly man and were preparing him to be taken to the hospital for further tests. "He is very weak, Mr. Silva," one of the doctors explained. "But with adequate treatment and the correct medication, there is hope. The intervention was crucial." Arthur nodded. Feeling a pang of hope mixed with bitterness, he picked up the briefcase, which was still on the nightstand, and put away the medicine vials and the crumpled note. These would be his evidence, but also a constant reminder of his failure and the need for vigilance. "Father, I'm coming with you," Arthur said, holding his father's hand as the nurses carefully transferred him to the stretcher. Luro, on his shoulder, watched everything attentively, his intelligent gaze fixed on Arthur. As they left the room, Arthur looked back. The room seemed different, lighter, as if the air had been purified. The farce was over, and the reconstruction, painful and uncertain, was just beginning. His father's health was the priority, but Arthur knew that the healing of his own soul would take much longer. The journey to unmask Clara was over, but the journey to heal his wounds was just beginning. Arthur accompanied his father's stretcher to the ambulance, his heart clenched by a mixture of fear and a strange sense of relief. Luro, still on his shoulder, seemed to share his apprehension, his small eyes fixed on the elderly man's pale face. Inside the ambulance, Arthur held his father's hand, feeling the fragility of his bones. "We're almost there, Father. You'll be fine," he murmured, more to himself than to his father, who seemed to be on the verge of unconsciousness. At the hospital, the medical team acted quickly. Arthur was directed to a waiting room, while his father was taken for urgent tests. The wait was excruciating. Each minute dragged like an hour, filled by the echo of Clara's words, by the image of the placebo vials, and by the guilt that gnawed at him. He had failed to protect the most important person in his life. Luro, perceiving Arthur's anguish, flew to the back of the chair beside him, letting out a soft chirp and rubbing his head against his arm. "Thank you, my friend," Arthur whispered, stroking the parrot's feathers. "You saved me. You saved my father." Hours later, a doctor came to speak with him. "Mr. Silva, your father is stable but very debilitated. The tests confirmed severe malnutrition and a failure in medication for his cardiac condition. It's a miracle he resisted so long. We will need time and intensive treatment, but we are optimistic." Arthur felt a lump in his throat. "So, he will recover?" "With due care, yes, but it will be a long process. He will need constant monitoring and a strict diet, and of course the correct medication," the doctor emphasized, casting a significant look at Arthur, who understood the implication. "He will have everything he needs," Arthur assured, his voice firm. The best care. He spent the night at the hospital, refusing to leave his father's side. He watched him sleep, his breath weak but steady. The image of Clara, once a figure of love and trust, was now a shadow of betrayal. Anger still bubbled, but it was mixed with a deep sadness for the loss of what he thought was his marriage. The next morning, after ensuring his father was under the best care, Arthur returned home. The mansion seemed empty, the silence heavy. His father's room, once a sanctuary of fragility, was now a reminder of the danger he had faced. Arthur picked up the briefcase, which he had brought from the hospital, and placed it on his desk. The medicine vials and Clara's note were the evidence, but also the catalysts of his new reality. He called his lawyer again, instructing him to accelerate the divorce proceedings and to ensure Clara had no access to any of his assets. I want her to have nothing, Marcus. Nothing. And I want a permanent restraining order, Arthur said, his voice cold and calculating. She tried to kill my father. That's non-negotiable. Understood, Arthur. I'll take care of everything, the lawyer replied, the seriousness in his voice reflecting the gravity of the situation. Hanging up the phone, Arthur felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. The reconstruction would be arduous. Not just his father's health, but his own life, his trust in people. He looked at Lauro, who was perched on a bookshelf watching him. Lauro, what would I do without you? The parrot tilted his head, as if understanding. Arthur knew that the legal battle with Clara would be dirty and painful. She wouldn't give up easily. But he was ready. The blindness had disappeared, replaced by a brutal clarity. He had lost his wife, but he had recovered his father and, in a way, himself. The house, once a home of illusions, now a battlefield for truth, and Arthur was determined to win. The journey of healing and justice was just beginning. Arthur's determination was a shield against the pain that threatened to consume him. The call with Marcus, his lawyer, was not just a legal step. It was a declaration of war. She tried to kill my father, Marcus, he had said, his voice icy. This isn't just divorce. I want her to answer for every day of suffering she caused. Marcus, on the other end of the line, had responded with the gravity the situation demanded. Understood, Arthur. I'll contact the prosecutor's office. With the evidence you have, we can go far beyond a divorce. This is attempted murder, or at the very least, abandonment of an incapacitated person with eventual intent. Prepare yourself, Arthur. She won't take this lying down. Hanging up the phone, Arthur felt the weight of the world on his shoulders, but also a strange lightness. In the days that followed, Arthur divided his time between the hospital and preparing for the legal storm that was brewing. His father, though still weak, showed signs of improvement. With each visit, Arthur saw a little more life return to the elderly man's eyes. He read to his father, told stories, and held his hand, feeling the connection that had been so brutally tested. You're getting stronger, Father, Arthur said, a genuine smile appearing on his face for the first time in a long time. Arthur's father squeezed his hand. Thanks to you, my son, and to Lauro. His eyes moved to the parrot, who was perched on the edge of the hospital room window, observing the movement outside. Lauro had become a constant presence, a silent reminder of truth and loyalty. Back at the mansion, the silence was deafening. Each room seemed to echo Clara's absence, but it wasn't an absence of longing, but rather of a toxic presence that had been extirpated. Arthur spent hours in his office, reviewing documents with Marcus, preparing for the legal battle. The briefcase, with the placebo vials and the crumpled note, was locked in a safe, the irrefutable proof of Clara's cruelty. Marcus warned him, Clara has already hired one of the city's most expensive lawyers, Arthur. She will fight tooth and nail. She will try to discredit you, your father, and even Lauro. She has nothing to lose now. Arthur nodded, his jaw clenched. Let her come. I'm not afraid of her. Not anymore. Anger, once a destructive emotion, was now fuel. One afternoon, while Arthur was in the office, Lauro flew to his desk, landing beside a photo frame with an old picture of Arthur and Clara, smiling, from a day that seemed to belong to another life. The parrot pecked at the image, as if wanting to erase it. "You're right, Lauro," Arthur murmured, picking up the photo frame and turning it face down. "Some memories are better forgotten." The reconstruction of his life was a slow and painful process. He felt guilt gnawing at him for having been so blind, but each day the image of his father recovering and the determination to seek justice propelled him. He began to re-evaluate everything: his businesses, his friendships, his own perception of himself. The first divorce hearing was scheduled. Marcus explained that it would only be an initial formality, but Arthur knew it would be the first direct confrontation with Clara since her departure. He mentally prepared to see her, to face her hatred and her lies. The night before the hearing, Arthur was sitting on the balcony looking at the stars. Lauro was on his shoulder, snuggled. The night breeze carried the scent of the forest, a reminder of the place where the truth had been revealed. "Lauro," Arthur whispered, "the fight isn't over, but I'm not alone. Not anymore." The parrot let out a soft chirp, a sound of comfort and complicity. Arthur knew that the journey would be long, full of obstacles and pain, but he also knew that, for the first time in a long time, he was on the right path. Justice for his father and healing for his own soul were the only things that mattered now. The battle was just beginning, and Arthur was ready to fight. The morning of the first divorce hearing dawned grey, reflecting Arthur's state of mind. He put on a dark suit, feeling the weight of formality and the impending battle. Lauro, sensing the tension, flew to his shoulder as he drank coffee, letting out a soft chirp as a silent reminder of his presence. "Today's the day, my friend," Arthur whispered, stroking the parrot's feathers. "The first step towards the end." In the courtroom, the atmosphere was charged. Arthur sat beside Marcus, his lawyer, feeling the heavy gaze of onlookers and journalists who crowded the corridors. The media had caught the scent of scandal, and the story of the betrayed millionaire and his hero Parrot was already beginning to circulate. Then she entered. Clara. Her hair was impeccably styled, an elegant dress covered her figure, and her face, though pale, displayed a mask of coldness and defiance. Her eyes met Arthur's for an instant, and he saw there not regret, but a contained fury, a determination to fight to the end. She was accompanied by a burly man in an expensive suit, her lawyer, known for his aggressiveness in court. Arthur felt a shiver, but didn't avert his gaze. The woman he loved was there, transformed into an implacable adversary. The pain of betrayal mingled with a cold and calculating rage. The hearing began with the formal proceedings. The judge, a middle-aged man with a tired expression, tried to maintain order. Marcus presented the divorce petition, mentioning improper conduct and attempted fraud, without going into more serious details at that moment. Clara's lawyer, Dr. Almeida, immediately rose. "Your Honor, my client vehemently denies all accusations. This is a litigious divorce where Mr. Silva, in a fit of unfounded rage and jealousy, attempts to defame the reputation of an honorable and dedicated woman. We demand that the allegations be proven and that Mr. Silva be prevented from using the media to manipulate public opinion." Clara, sitting upright, nodded with an expression of feigned hurt. Arthur felt his blood boil, but Marcus placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Your Honor," Marcus intervened, "we have substantial evidence that will be presented at the opportune moment. However, for this initial hearing, We only ask that the divorce proceedings continue and that precautionary measures be taken to protect Mr. Silva's assets and ensure the safety of his father, who is currently hospitalized due to gross negligence. The word negligence made Clara tremble slightly, almost imperceptibly. Her eyes locked on Arthur, full of hatred. The judge, after hearing the initial arguments, decided to schedule a new hearing for the presentation of evidence and issued a temporary restraining order for Clara, preventing her from approaching Arthur and his father. "This is absurd!" Clara exclaimed, rising abruptly. "I am the victim here. My husband is persecuting me." "Madam, please compose yourself," the judge warned, banging his gavel. "Court is adjourned for today." As he left the courtroom, Arthur felt a mixture of exhaustion and relief. The first round was over, and he had kept his composure. Marcus walked beside him, his expression serious. "She will fight dirty, Arthur," Marcus said. "That restraining order deeply angered her. She will try to discredit everything you say." "I know," Arthur replied, his voice hoarse. "But she doesn't have the truth on her side, and I have the evidence." He went straight to the hospital. His father was awake, a little stronger, and a faint smile lit up his face upon seeing Arthur. Lauro, whom Arthur had left at home with a caregiver, seemed to be with him in spirit. "How did it go, my son?" his father asked, his voice still weak. "It was the first step, father," Arthur said, holding the elderly man's hand. "She won't get away with it. I promise." That night, back at the mansion, Arthur sat on the balcony, the silence of the house contrasting with the maelstrom in his mind. Lauro flew to his shoulder, snuggling. Arthur felt the warmth of the small body, a comfort amidst the coldness of the battle. "There's still much to do, Lauro," he murmured, looking at the stars. "But I won't give up. For you, for him, for me." The journey of healing and justice was just beginning, and Arthur knew that each step would be painful, but necessary. He was ready for the war Clara had declared. Clara's fury was a contained fire. In Dr. Almeida's luxurious office overlooking the city, she could barely sit still. The restraining order, the mention of gross negligence, all of it was a personal insult. "This is an outrage, Almeida," she exclaimed, her voice low and hissing but laden with venom. "He's trying to destroy me, and the judge, he believed his insinuations." Dr. Almeida, a middle-aged man with astute eyes and a smile that rarely reached his eyes, nodded calmly. "Calm down, Mrs. Silva. This is just the beginning. Arthur is playing the victim card, trying to gain the sympathy of the court and the media, but we have a strategy." Clara clenched her hands. "What strategy? He has the parrot, the briefcase. He has the evidence I discarded." "Circumstantial evidence, Mrs. Silva," Almeida corrected, his tone gently condescending. "A parrot that talks and a briefcase that could have been planted. Arthur's credibility is our target. He is acting erratically, emotionally unstable. We will question his sanity, his ability to discern reality. After all, who in their right mind would base such serious accusations on a bird?" Clara looked at him, a spark of hope in her eyes. "Do you think you can turn this against him?" "Absolutely," Almeida smiled, a calculating glint in his eye. "We will paint Arthur as an unbalanced man, consumed by paranoia and jealousy, manipulated by an ambitious lawyer. His father, a fragile and confused elderly man, and the parrot. Well, the parrot will be the icing on the cake for our narrative of delusion. The media loves a story of madness and obsession." He picked up a file. "We already have some contacts in the press. We will begin to sow doubt. Arthur's reputation will be tarnished before he can even present his evidence." Meanwhile, at the mansion, Arthur and Marcus were preparing for the storm. Marcus had predicted Clara's move. "She will try to discredit you, Arthur," Marcus explained, spreading documents on the office table. She will say you are mentally unstable, that the parrot is a fantasy, that the evidence was fabricated. It's the standard tactic for those who don't have the truth on their side. Arthur clenched his fists. I don't care what she says about me, but I will not allow her to attack my father or Lauro. That's why we need to be surgical, Marcus replied. We will shield your father with medical testimonies that prove the negligence and his improvement after the interruption of the placebos. As for Lauro, well, he is an unusual witness, but his constant presence and the way he reacted to the briefcase are facts. We might need an animal behavior expert to attest to the veracity of his actions. The pain of betrayal still gnawed at Arthur, but the anger at Clara trying to distort the truth and harm his father was a shield. She has no limits, does she? Not when money and power are at stake, Marcus said, his voice serious. She will fight to the last drop, but we have the truth, Arthur, and the briefcase, that is irrefutable. That afternoon, Arthur visited his father at the hospital. The elderly man was sitting reading a book, a faint but genuine smile on his face. The improvement was remarkable. You're much better, father, Arthur said, feeling a deep relief. Thanks to you, my son, his father replied, his voice firmer, and to our little hero. His eyes moved to Lauro, who was perched on the window, observing the movement outside, unaware of the legal battle unfolding. The fight will be tough, father, Arthur confessed, sitting beside the bed. Clara won't give up. Arthur's father held his hand. I know, my son, but you are not alone, and the truth always finds a way. Don't forget that. His father's words were a balm for Arthur's soul. He needed that strength, for Clara's offensive was not long in coming. In the following days, the media began to buzz with articles and social media posts, carefully orchestrated by Almeida's team. Headlines like "Millionaire in Crisis," "Delusions of Jealousy and a Parrot Witness," and "The Vengeance of a Betrayed Husband." Unfounded accusations against his wife began to circulate. The story of the hero parrot was ridiculed, transformed into proof of Arthur's mental instability. His image was painted as that of an unbalanced man, obsessed with personal revenge. Arthur saw the news with a mixture of anger and disgust. Clara's venom was palpable. Lauro, on his shoulder, let out a sharp squawk, as if sensing the tension. They're trying to drive me insane, Lauro, Arthur murmured, stroking the parrot's feathers. But they won't succeed, Marcus called, his voice calm but firm. The defamation campaign has begun, Arthur, exactly as we predicted. Don't react publicly, let us handle it. The truth will come out in court. Arthur hung up the phone, feeling the weight of the battle. The war Clara had declared was dirty, personal and relentless. But with each lie, each attack on his reputation, Arthur's determination grew stronger. He was not just fighting for justice, but for his father's honor and his own sanity. He looked at the briefcase, locked in the safe, the irrefutable proof of Clara's cruelty. The truth was his greatest weapon, and Arthur was ready to use it. The next hearing would be the battlefield where truth and lies would brutally confront each other. The day dawned heavy and grey, as if the sky sensed the gravity of what was to come. Arthur entered the courtroom with Marcus by his side, feeling the weight of curious glances and camera flashes that lit up outside. Clara's defamation campaign had taken effect, and he was now a controversial figure in the media, but in his heart, anger had transformed into a resolute calm. He was no longer fighting for himself, but for justice, for his father's honor, and for the truth Lauro had uncovered. Clara was already seated, flanked by Dr. Almeida, her expression a mask of calculating coldness, but Arthur noticed an almost imperceptible tremor in her hands. She knew what was in the briefcase. The hearing began. Dr. Almeida, with his grave and persuasive voice, began Clara's defense, painting Arthur as an unstable man consumed by jealousy and delusions who had fabricated a fanciful story to take revenge on a dedicated wife. He ridiculed the idea of a parrot as a witness and suggested that the evidence would be, at best, planted. Marcus, in turn, waited patiently. When his turn came, he addressed the judge with an imposing seriousness. "Your Honor, Mrs. Silver's defense attempts to deflect the focus from the truth with personal and unfounded attacks. We are not here to discuss Mr. Silver's sanity, but rather to present irrefutable facts about Mrs. Silver's conduct and the criminal negligence that almost cost Arthur's father his life." Marcus then called Arthur's father's doctor, Dr. Mendez, who testified about the inexplicable deterioration of the elderly man's health under Clara's care and his subsequent and rapid improvement after the interruption of the placebos and the administration of the correct medication. "The toxicology reports and medication records are clear, Your Honor," Dr. Mendez stated. "There was a systematic substitution of vital medications with inert substances." A murmur ran through the room. Clara turned pale, and Dr. Almeida rose to question, but the judge interrupted him, asking him to wait. Then Marcus called Arthur. With a firm voice, Arthur narrated Laura's discovery, the briefcase in the forest, the initial confusion, and finally, the terrible truth revealed by the labels and the parrot's behavior. He described the shock, the pain of betrayal, and the determination to unmask Clara. "And where is this irrefutable evidence, Mr. Silver?" Dr. Almeida intervened with a scornful tone. "We've seen nothing but your word and that of a bird." "The evidence is here, Your Honor," Marcus declared, and with a dramatic gesture, asked for the briefcase to be brought. A bailiff placed the leather briefcase, still bearing the marks of the forest, on the table in the center of the room. Arthur opened it, revealing the medicine vials, the placebos, and the documents. "Here are the original medications of Mr. Silver Sr., with prescriptions and expiration dates," Marcus explained, pointing. "And here, the placebos that Mrs. Silver administered, carefully packaged to resemble the originals. Laboratory analysis confirmed the absence of active ingredients in these vials." The silence in the room was palpable. Clara's eyes were fixed on the briefcase, her face contorted in a mixture of fury and despair. Dr. Almeida tried to argue that the evidence could have been manipulated, that Arthur was a vengeful man, but his words sounded hollow in the face of the material evidence. "Your Honor," Marcus continued, "Mr. Silver did not act alone. He was guided by an unlikely but undeniable witness, his parrot Lauro, who witnessed Mrs. Silver swapping the medications and who instinctively alerted Arthur to the importance of the briefcase. Animal intelligence should not be underestimated when it comes to observable facts." Clara, unable to contain herself, rose abruptly. "This is a farce. He's lying. I would never do that." Her voice was choked, her facade crumbling. "Madam, compose yourself," the judge warned, banging his gavel. "The evidence is compelling. The court cannot ignore the material evidence and medical testimony." After a few more hours of testimonies and counter-arguments, the judge delivered the verdict. He granted Arthur the divorce, declaring Clara guilty of gross negligence and fraud with the intent to cause harm to Arthur's father. He ordered that Clara be criminally investigated and that all assets she had tried to transfer be frozen and returned to Arthur. The restraining order became permanent. The room erupted in murmurs. Clara collapsed in her chair, her face in her hands, her ambition and cruelty finally exposed. Dr. Almeida, visibly shaken, tried to console her, but the game was over. Arthur felt an immense relief. A weight he didn't know he was carrying finally lifted. He had won. The truth had prevailed. His father was sitting in the armchair, Lauro perched on his shoulder, gently pecking at his hair. Upon seeing Arthur, a radiant smile lit up the elderly man's face. "You did it, my son," his father said. his voice strong and clear. "I knew you would." Arthur hugged his father tightly, tears streaming down his face. "Yes, Dad, we did it thanks to you and our little hero." He looked at Loro, who chirped softly, as if understanding every word. In the days that followed, the media, once skeptical, now celebrated the story of the hero Parrot and the justice that had been served. Arthur, however, didn't care for fame. He was focused on rebuilding his life and caring for his father. The mansion, once a stage of intrigue and lies, now breathed peace. Arthur, his father, and Loro spent their afternoons on the balcony, watching the sunset. The journey had been painful, but Arthur had found not only justice, but also a new perspective on love, loyalty, and the importance of truth. Loro, the little guardian of truth, flew to Arthur's shoulder, snuggling. Arthur stroked his feathers, a genuine smile on his face. The briefcase, now empty of its dark contents, was a silent reminder of the past. But the future, finally, seemed bright and full of hope. The farce had been unmasked, and life for Arthur and his father could finally begin anew.